Imagine standing in front of a car so massive that its engine alone feels like it could power a small ship. The world of classic cars was filled with giants, machines that weren't built for fuel economy, but for sheer power, prestige, and the thrill of dominance on the road. These engines weren't just mechanical hearts. They were statements of what human engineering could achieve at a time when boundaries were meant to be pushed. Today, we begin our journey through 20 of the largest engines ever installed in classic cars. Engines that turned ordinary drives into unforgettable legends. One of the first monsters we encounter comes from the 1930s, Cadillac's VERS16. At a time when most cars barely managed simple four-cylinder engines, Cadillac shocked the world with a massive 7.4-liter, 16-cylinder beast. It wasn't just about speed, but about luxury. The smoothness of this engine made every ride feel like gliding on air, and the sight of that long hood became a symbol of wealth and authority. This was more than transportation. It was rolling royalty. But Cadillac wasn't alone in chasing size. Across the Atlantic, Rolls-Royce had its Phantom II, powered by an engine so large it seemed endless under the bonnet. The British approach wasn't about raw aggression but refined power, making these cars float down the road with grace. The massive straight-six engine gave an impression of quiet strength, like a lion walking calmly, knowing it can strike at any moment. As the years moved forward, America became the playground of oversized engines. Packard, another legendary name, released its Twin Six, a 12-cylinder powerhouse that rivaled Cadillac's efforts. For wealthy families, choosing between Packard and Cadillac wasn't just about the car. It was about loyalty, about picking a side in the battle of giants. By the 1950s, the world had stepped into the golden age of chrome and horsepower. Chrysler introduced its firepower Hemi Vate, an engine so wide and heavy that mechanics joked it could break a man's back. It wasn't simply about design. It was a revolution in performance, shaping the muscle car culture that would later dominate the 1960s and 70s. Every rev of a Hemi sent chills down the spine of anyone within earshot. And then came Lincoln, with its massive V12s and later monstrous Vates. Some argued these engines were less refined, more of an extension of Ford's flathead technology, but their sheer presence underlined something bigger. Size mattered, and people loved the bragging rights of owning the largest machine on the street. The Europeans didn't stay silent either. Mercedes-Benz, Ferrari, and Aston Martin started experimenting with their own massive engines. While American cars chased cubic inches, the Europeans focused on precision, balancing size with performance. Ferrari's Colombo V12, though smaller compared to America's giants, pushed boundaries in racing and inspired future supercars. By the time we reach the late 1960s, the world is roaring with muscle. Chevrolet drops its 454 big block, Pontiac rolls out its 421, and Ford fires back with the legendary 427. Each of these engines was a thunderstorm in metal form. The cars weren't always practical, but they didn't need to be. They were built to roar down highways, leaving trails of adrenaline and envy behind them. But the story doesn't stop here. For every Cadillac VERS16 or Chrysler Hemi, there's an even bigger beast waiting in the shadows. As we move deeper into this journey, you'll see engines so enormous that the word car hardly seems enough. Some of them were closer to airplane power plants, engines that seemed like they didn't belong on the streets at all. So, if you think the Cadillac VERS16 was big, or that Chrysler's Hemi was the peak, stay with me. Because the giants that follow are even larger, louder, and wilder than you could imagine. The story of the largest engines in history has just begun, and the most jaw-dropping machines are still waiting ahead. The world of oversized engines only grew louder as the decades rolled on. By the 1970s, horsepower wars were in full swing. Manufacturers competed not for efficiency but for bragging rights, and the bigger the number, the greater the legend. For car lovers, this was paradise, a time when cubic inches and displacement were everything. Let's begin with Chevrolet, a brand that stamped its authority with the legendary 454 big block Vate. Introduced in the early 1970s, this massive 7.4-liter engine powered icons like the Chevelle SS and the Corvette Dot. Imagine pressing the accelerator and unleashing a tidal wave of torque that pushed your body deep into the seat. The 454 wasn't just a motor. It was raw muscle, a declaration that Chevrolet would not be ignored in the horsepower race. But Chevy wasn't alone. Ford was right there with its 427 Cobra Jet V8, a powerhouse that turned Mustangs into street predators. The roar of this engine became a soundtrack of American roads. It wasn't about smoothness or elegance. It was about dominance, about making sure every car at the stoplight knew it was facing a monster. Owners didn't just drive these cars. They commanded them like captains steering battleships. Across town, Pontiac introduced the 421 Super Duty V8, a giant that carried the GTO into legend. Known as the first muscle car, the GTO became a symbol of youth, rebellion, and speed. The Super Duty was Pontiac's answer to every rival engine, a combination of displacement and engineering that made sure Pontiac stayed in the fight for glory. And then came Chrysler, again making waves with its 426 Hemi, an engine so powerful it was banned from NASCAR at one point for being too dominant. Nicknamed the Elephant because of its sheer size and weight, the 426 Hemi is still whispered about as one of the greatest engines ever built. Under the hood of a Dodge Charger or a Plymouth Barracuda, the Hemi didn't just move cars. It created legends that Hollywood would later immortalize in movies like Fast and Furious. Meanwhile, Cadillac still held its crown in luxury and size. In 1970, they introduced the 500 cubic inch V8, the largest production engine ever fitted into a passenger car. That's 8.2 liters of displacement, a motor so big it sounded like thunder rolling down the boulevard. It didn't need to scream or rev high. Its presence was enough. Driving a Cadillac with that engine was like commanding a ship, floating with power that could swallow highways whole. Let's not forget Buick, with its massive 455 V8, an engine that turned the Riviera and the Skylark GES into silent assassins. Unlike the loud muscle cars, Buick built a reputation for torque, mountains of it. The 455 wasn't always about top-end speed, but about raw pulling power. Floor it, and you could feel the world shift behind you. Oldsmobile wasn't far behind, unleashing its own 455 Rocket V8, which earned its name for good reason. Installed in cars like the 442, it gave drivers the feeling of being strapped to a rocket on four wheels. The competition between Oldsmobile, Buick, Pontiac, and Chevrolet created an era that enthusiasts still call the muscle car wars. But while America was flexing cubic inches, Europe had its own giants to boast about. Mercedes-Benz unveiled engines that were smaller in size but massive in innovation. Their V8s and V12s, like the one in the Mercedes 600 Grosser, weren't built for drag racing. They were built for kings, queens, and presidents. That car wasn't just transportation, it was rolling authority. When a Mercedes 600 pulled up, the world noticed, and the giant engine under its hood made sure of it. Jaguar, meanwhile, turned heads with its 5.3-liter V12, a motor that transformed the E-Type into something almost otherworldly. It wasn't as large as America's giants, but it combined grace and muscle in a way only the British could. Driving a V12 E-Type was like dancing with power. You felt speed and smoothness blending into one unforgettable experience. And then there was Ferrari, refining its Colombo V12s into machines that ruled racetracks and boulevards alike. While displacement numbers were smaller, the performance spoke louder than size. Ferrari proved that an engine didn't have to be massive to be mighty, and yet their V12s still earned a place in the history of giants for their dominance and charisma. By now, our list has covered legends from both sides of the ocean, but we still haven't reached the absolute extremes. The Cadillac 500 was huge. The 454 was ferocious. The Hemi was unforgettable. But there are even larger and stranger engines waiting ahead. Engines that pushed the limits so far, they left behind stories that still echo through time. Stay with me, because in our final chapter, we'll meet the rarest monsters, engines that didn't just define cars, but redefined the very idea of what a car could be. Some were closer to airplanes, some were closer to experiments gone mad, and all of them are unforgettable. The greatest giants are still waiting. The story of giant engines is not just about numbers, it's about dreams, ambition, and sometimes even madness. As we step into the final part of this journey, we meet the rarest and wildest machines ever created, cars that stretch the limits of engineering and imagination. These were not everyday vehicles. They were mechanical titans, often built in small numbers, and today they live as legends of size, sound, and speed. One of the most outrageous examples comes from the American company Pierce Arrow, with its massive V12 engines in the 1930s. At a time when most people were happy with modest 4 cylinders, Pierce Arrow offered smooth 12-cylinder monsters that made their luxury cars glide like ships on land. These cars were statements of wealth, but they were also rolling laboratories for what engines could achieve. And then came the Duesenberg Model J, powered by an inline-8 so huge it made rivals look small. With nearly 7 liters of displacement, the Duesenberg was the king of its time, capable of over 115 miles per hour, in an era when airplanes were still struggling to reach that speed. Owning a Duesenberg wasn't just about having a car, it was about declaring yourself part of history. The extremes didn't stop there. In the post-war era, Chrysler experimented with aircraft-inspired technology, even creating turbine cars that ran not on gasoline, but on jet-like engines. Though not truly mass-produced, the idea alone showed just how far engineers were willing to go. If they could fit a jet engine in a car, why not dream of anything? Let's not forget Bugatti, a name tied to artistry and engineering. Long before the modern Veyron and Chiron, Bugatti crafted massive straight 8 and even 16-cylinder prototypes. These engines were not about practicality, but prestige. Each Bugatti was a rolling piece of art, and its engine was the beating heart that made it legendary. So, what do all these giants teach us? They remind us that engines weren't always about practicality or rules. They were about passion, pride, and the pursuit of something larger than life. In a world where today's cars are shrinking engines for efficiency, looking back at these giants feels almost mythical. They were machines that refused to whisper. They only knew how to roar. And here's the best part, the story never really ends. Because every time you hear the deep growl of a V8, the smooth song of a V12, or the thunder of a big block waking up, you're hearing echoes of these legends. The Cadillac 500, the Chevy 454, the Chrysler Hemi, the Jaguar V12, they all live on, not just in museums but in the hearts of enthusiasts. The giants of the past built a legacy that inspires engineers even today. Tomorrow's engines may be electric, silent, and efficient, but the memory of these massive power plants will forever rumble in the background of automotive history. And if you've stayed with me until now, you already know, the roar of these giants is not just history. It's a loop, always calling us back, always making us press play one more time to relive their thunder. Because when legends this big exist, once is never enough.